begin. Welcome to our session. So we have new standards in high school. I know we have probably more than just high school teachers here. We might even have some middle school teachers here, but they've had them for a little bit longer. So the purpose for today in the short period that I have is to be able to give you a bit of an introduction, if that's possible, in a 45-minute period, because usually the work that we do as preparation for standards is a lot more than just 45 minutes. So I was really trying to think, what can I do to give this kind of an introduction in such a short period of time, and we'll see if it works out. My biggest hope for today is that you walk away first understanding the basis of why and what, and potentially even how, right? Like those are the big things. What are these new standards? Why are we making the changes? And what is there available for me? And not for me, but for you. So there's been a lot of work happening with these new standards for a while. We're going to get through as much as we can. I invite you at any time, if you have questions, to unmute and go ahead and speak. I think that's great. If you're uncomfortable with that, I would rather prefer just putting in the chat. That's okay too. I'll try to check that as much as I can as I'm presenting. But we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to start first with a bit of kind of a short history of science education, science education research, and Utah standards. What I want you to be looking for as we go through this is, how did we get here, right? Like where did this all start? Where did this begin? Where are we now? What are the steps along the way? What changes were made, for example? What did we learn from each of these changes along the way? Because as we made each of these shifts, we learned a little bit more. In the same way, as science teachers, we understand this well. In the same way that science understanding of the natural world changes as new information comes in, the same occurs in our understanding of how kids learn best, and now specifically how kids learn science best. So a lot of what we do is based in science education research. So again, as you go through this, try to identify, if you've been teaching for a long time, or even if you're fairly new, what kind of science instruction are you using, and what were the basis behind those things? So to get us started, we're going to start with the oldest way of teaching science. It was been around, as you can see from just the type of picture we're looking at here. It's been for a really, really long time, and that is direct instruction. Now, please make sure you understand there are lots of kinds of direct instruction. I'm not saying that this is always bad or always good, but there are pros and cons to direct instruction. First and foremost, for the teacher's perspective, it's super easy. Teachers know a lot, and they love having the opportunity to share what they know with their students. So you can just get up there and tell them all you know. If you're engaging and you have some cool stories to share or whatever, you can make it exciting, but you're still giving kids the information. We feel smart, we feel in control. It works for some students. Some kids thrive on this kind of learning. The cons, on the other hand, is that it doesn't work for everyone. Not everyone can pay attention. Not everyone can understand it clearly. Not everyone follows everything you're saying. Sometimes you've probably been in those university courses where a professor knows so much they're talking over your heads. So sometimes that occurs as well. Another big thing is this wonderful statistic that says that students in classes that with the traditional stand and deliver lectures are 1.5 more times likely to fail than students with classes with more stimulating or active learning methods. So again, there are some pros and some cons. I always love to mention this. For example, there are times when direct instruction is best, like when it comes to classroom laboratory safety. We don't ever try to tell kids or let kids experience that firsthand by, like, see how Tommy burned himself? Now we know we don't touch the Bunsen burner, right? I mean, so in sometimes there are ways that we need to make sure that we are giving that kind of direct instruction. Then a long time ago, back in the 30s, right? Developmental psychology and psychology researchers found that there's a lot more to learning than just listening, right? So telling is not teaching, listening is not learning. In 34, Vygotsky started talking more about conceptual understanding is more than just memorization. Piaget in 36, cognitive development in students kind of builds students' mental models. So I mean, in these ideas back from a very, very long time ago, we started learning that just hearing things doesn't necessarily mean we're learning them. This table here is one that I like to show. It definitely doesn't come from Vygotsky or Piaget, but it does kind of give a representation of we remember 10% of what we read, all the way up to 90% of doing it is what we learn. So the more we can get engaged in doing it, the more our students will be learning. So with that, so again, the biggest thing about this is this understanding of being active learners is not new. We've known this for a very, very, very long time, but for some reason in science education, things didn't start changing until 1957. In 1957, when Sputnik, this tiny piece of metal, was shot up into space, suddenly, for some reason, because of a Russian advantage, because of a lack of US access to scientists, there was a shift. We need to improve the way we teach science. And this is where science started really changing. Science education started really changing here in our country. In the 1970s and 80s, this book called Science for All Americans came out, and it's kind of created this new idea of hands-on learning, right? So what we started doing is we need to get kids engaged and having fun doing science. The intent was doing really that when learning is fun, kids will want to do it more. So it's really about building interest. And I think a lot of us as teachers really love this kind of hands-on learning. We love seeing those kids get engaged and get excited about science. The challenges that we found with hands-on learning is that just because they're having fun doesn't necessarily mean that they're learning science. They'd be like, wow, science is great. When you try to ask them the concepts that they're learning, they may not fully understand what it was. So yeah, so that's the beginning. Get them engaged, right? This is the beginning of like the Mr. Wizard TV show and things like that, where it's like, ooh, science is amazing. Back around that same time too, in the early 80s is when the beginning of standards here in the state of Utah. When I asked someone who was around for that process, and I said, so tell me, what was that like? And this is the quote, in all the records that we have at our office, I could not find a copy of what these standards look like. So I asked, like, what do they look like? And this is what I was told. Well, the first set of our Utah science standards were mostly based on topics found in the tables of contents of our favorite science textbooks. So we just kind of organized, all right, what content do we want to teach? How do we want to organize that? Boom, 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 boom. There wasn't more thought other than the content itself. In the 90s, we started introducing the inquiry model. So this was to come over that hands-on learning where kids were just having fun but not really learning science, where let's get them more engaged in a more structured kind of a way to allow them to be able to do this. So again, what changed? Students were engaged in authentic science practices. So instead of just doing science, we wanted them to be actively engaged in the practices, thinking of this is the beginning of when our standards first had our intended learning outcomes at the beginning, the ILOs. Again, the purpose was to get kids engaged in practices that'll help them be like scientists. So the problem that we found with this is when we got kids actively engaged in science, it started producing these more cookbook labs, right? Where if we get kids to take these things step by step by step, they'll be better understand how science thinks and how scientists work. And again, what we found is that sometimes acting like a scientist doesn't necessarily mean that students are thinking like a scientist. So just because they were going through motions, we still find they weren't actually learning as much as we thought they would. Here's an early version of our 1990s standards. This is a biology one, for example. You'll see they actually look pretty similar to the ones that we just finished using this last year. So I mean, they're, again, we start getting some more verbs in there, right? So instead of just content alone, we're talking about identifying and illustrating and explaining. So we start kind of getting into that beginnings of science practices. Later in the 2000s, these other two books I have on the left are showing up. And they start talking about more of a learning-focused form of inquiry. Instead of being more teacher-driven like the last one, which is if we give them the steps, they can figure it out. Now we try to get the students to be the ones to try to make sense of them. Students were given control of their steps. I remember when this was the thing when I was going through my pre-service program as a teacher, and inquiry was the big thing. It was like, well, you can't give them too much. They need to come up with things. And we all kind of struggled with that because we didn't really know exactly what that meant, right? Kids sometimes struggled as well because without the proper structures, kids were kind of lost. They were like, what do I do? Like, you want me to put procedures together? How do I do that, right? But again, the intent was to give kids more control in how they do science. The teacher kind of takes a secondary supporting role, like, well, I see you're struggling. What are you trying to work on here? And more of that facilitation piece. The challenge is that, again, it was thought that as students get better at doing science, what happened was sometimes some of the kids thrived in this and some fell even further behind. Another thing too is teachers thrived this model and others were like, nope, this is too much. My kids aren't learning. They can't handle this. I give up. And so there's a big division in what happened here in this kind of learning because of the kind of professional learning that was available for teachers, but also in the way that it was being accepted by students. Then we get to the standards again that you should be fairly familiar with. These are biology standards. And again, they look fairly similar to the ones we just saw with some different fonts and formatting. You'll also notice that the indicators themselves, each of the letter pieces, there's a little bit of increase in each of those bullets is kind of based on Bloom's taxonomy of depth of knowledge, right? So we start with listing and then we identify and we move to explain or things like that. So again, a lot more in terms of kids doing for themselves and trying to make sense of things. And that brings us to where we are today in three-dimensional science teaching. So as you can see, every one of these steps was kind of built upon the shoulders of the last. And so what we learned in the last one is that, okay, we want kids to be actively engaged and being the ones making decisions when it comes to what science looks like. We want them to be like scientists, but they need a little more structure. They need a little more support. So what are those supports? And those kind of get into what we've called the three-dimensional science. So as we do this, right, we give kids access to a natural phenomena. We give them something to look at, something to observe. And then we, instead of saying, all right, now today we're going to learn about density and let me tell you all about density. And now that you know all about density, let's practice our understanding of density. Instead, what we do is we might present them with something that really clearly represents density. I think of one that I used to show with a long, tall, graduated cylinder with many different colored liquids. You've probably done this if you've taught density. And instead of finishing with that kind of assignment or that kind of a lesson, you start with it. You show that to the students and say, what are your questions? Let's draw some models to figure out what we think is happening that's causing this to occur. And we kind of swap it on his head so that the students have the opportunity to make sense of things, and we present them with the phenomena to try to make sense of it. Again, the intent is to help give students the supports that they need to engage in the practices and also to make sense of what's happening. That's something that was kind of missing in the past. This whole idea of making sense. There's a lot of times that we would tell the kids, no, this is what it means. And rarely did they get the chance for themselves to say, here's what I think it means. And so that, again, is kind of the shift. So one of the challenges we found so far, right, in this process is that it kind of creates a bit of a re-novicing of teachers. We're taking teachers that have taught now for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 plus years, and we're saying, think of the great things you've done and flip them on their heads. Instead of ending with a great lab after a wonderful, engaging lecture, do the lab first, right? And let the kids be the ones to try to come up with things. And as you find holes in their understanding, you fill them in, whether it's through a reading or whether it's through a small or short lecture or whatever it is, but you give them what they need to make sense of what it is they're seeing in the world around them. And that leads us to our current standards. So these are a copy of the SEED standards. If you haven't seen these before, we'll make sure to just share them out so you have access to see them. These SEED standards shift thinking a lot, because instead of having a list of content to know or practices or things to be able to kind of make sense of with these little sub-steps, what it really does is it breaks it down into what we call a performance expectation, right? This is the end. If you look at, for example, Standard Bio 2.1, how do you know whether you're done, whether your kids have learned this? Well, when they can construct an explanation based on evidence that all organisms are primarily composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, right? I mean, when they can do this, check, that one's done. So there's a lot of questions that come with this. Teachers are like, great, but how do I get there? And what does this look like? And where do I go? And that's one thing that we found was one of the biggest, well, one of the hardest things for us to handle in this rollout of these new standards is that these standards in themselves give very, very little by way of supports, right? It's like, and here you go, figure it out. So that's kind of where I want to spend some time on in a bit later today as we look at that and we look at what are those supports in place to kind of make sense of that. So here it is. Here is the chain of all the steps right along the way, looking at the different research from just direct instruction only to understanding this depth of knowledge comes from doing as opposed to just talking, all the way up to where we are today with our SEED standards. Now, with this, I want to take a bit of time. So I'm going to go back to this. I didn't really talk explicitly about it. This document right here, I always have it with me right here. This book, A Framework for K-12 Science Education, is the basis of the and research that really supports our understanding of how kids best learn science today, right? What this talks about specifically are not only those 3 dimensions and how they work, but also goes more specifically into what the progressions look like, right? What does this kind of teaching look like in the K2 level, in the 3-5 level, in the 6-8 middle school level, and also in the 9-12 high school level? And it really gives and helps present us with that good understanding of not only the basis that we need to build from, but also where we're going. What are our goals when it comes to kids modeling or explaining or creating arguments, or even using reasoning skills like looking for patterns or cause and effect, etc. So the beginning of this document gives a good basis for what's and whys and hows. And I want to take some time with you to do this today. These 2 sections here, I hope you can see them well on your screen. I want you to read through them. And I want you to go ahead first and just take some time first and read through these. We'll do this a few times and look for what you think. What is the goal and how does this work, right? So take some time to read those. Okay, you might still be going, but I'm going to move on a bit. If you could use the chat right now, what are the words that really stand out to you, and type it into the chat that stand out to what is the goal of this? What really stood out to you as being the goal for this new vision for science education? Okay, thanks for those who participated. Again, if you're still typing, continue. We're going to keep doing this a few times. So again, when we're looking at this, I love what was written, right? So engage and apply, investigate, actively engage, deepen understanding. I mean, these really are the purposes of this new shift, right? It's hard to imagine how going back to the original idea of just stand and deliver, right? That direct instruction, it's really hard to think of ways that kids are engaging or applying or investigating, right? So this is really giving them that depth, looking back to that triangle that I showed that was not Vygotsky or Piaget, but again, giving them access to doing these things. So the next step, right, in the how section, some of you have kind of already touched on this as well, but when we look at this, right, so how do we do this? How do we give kids the opportunity to engage this way? So look for some words that stand out to you there in the yellow section. All right, you guys are hitting on the same things that I really stand out to me, right? I really like what Scott said, right? Direct instruction does not give them the chance for opportunities, right? So like opportunity is important. Um, I love Deborah's comment also about the questions that we have about the world. So they should have questions. There's one of my favorite quotes from people who have been working in this for a long time is that wouldn't it be wonderful if students graduated more curious than they started in kindergarten? And sometimes in the way that we currently teach science, curiosity seems to get beaten out of students, right? As they have questions, but teachers sometimes like, oh, we don't have time for that today. Um, but giving them the opportunity to come up with their questions, right, and build their curiosity, that's exactly what we want. And Jessica, that's the one that stood out to me the most, actually, of all of these, is we want engage students in ways for them to see how scientists have investigated and found answers to their questions, right? We want them to be able to do that. How did scientists do this? Not just say like, well, scientists know, but well, how did they know? How did we get here? There's a process that creates this. Think of all the misconceptions that exist today in regards to science, right? This misunderstanding of what science is or science isn't, and well, science changes so much we can't trust science. Well, but that's the scientific process. Like science is all about changing. It's all about getting a better understanding with new information based on new technology or new discoveries, etc. All right, now we have the next ones, the whys and the whos. So we're going to first focus on the why, right? So like, why make these shifts? I think, again, it kind of gets repetitive because I think we've all been thinking about this, but read what the document itself says about why and put some comments in about why is this important? And I know most of you know this because of how we've all been teaching for these last few months. But it's so difficult to teach in this way, right? Like I think Mike said it at the very end of his presentation this morning, where he was like, usually you can see the audience, you can bounce ideas off each other. It's just so difficult to teach this online way. So hopefully we'll be able to have some discussion about that as well and what that can look like in this format. Um, but yeah, one thing I love about the whys, and I think you guys are really hitting on it, right? Like this isn't about science teaching is not about, okay, not only about preparing the next level of scientists, right? That's not it. The large majority of our kids will never become scientists or even engineers, right? But they will be citizens in a society that needs them to be critical consumers of information. I don't mean to be political, but it's a perfect example, right? All it takes is for someone to get in front of people and say, to cure this virus, we must now drink bleach or whatever, right? Like that is not the way to go. We need to make sure that people can hear that and go like, that doesn't sound right to me. I love what Scott said before. The people have lost their ability to question everything, and I think what's happened is because, and this is just from the book of Ricky Scott, but I think what happens is because our education system has taught kids to listen and obey, that's what they do. And when something comes up in a public statement where someone says something, they go, oh, well, it was said, it must be true. As opposed to being able to question, being able to have a little bit of scrutiny in their mind to be like, is this a correct statement? That seems very different than what I've heard, right? And question. Um, Thank you for everyone for your hard, again, life skills, right? Um, yeah, we need to be critical thinkers at all times in our lives. So those are fantastic. Okay, next section, who. This I think is super important, right? Because sometimes when we think about who we teach science to, I already mentioned this, but well, this kid's not going to be a scientist anyway. So it's really no big deal. But that's, again, that's not the purpose. So who are we talking about? So take some time to read that if you haven't yet. I know in the rural areas of our state, right? In the times that I've been out there working with teachers and seeing that for myself, there sometimes is a lot of talk about, well, our kids they work on farms, right? They this or they that, and kind of these assumptions are made, or they work on their cattle, or they work on whatever it is that they're doing. Um, but at the same time, I love it when I hear teachers say, but these kids are the best problem solvers I've ever worked with because they know firsthand how to solve problems, how to identify an issue and solve a problem. And if we can harness that, right, and give these kids the opportunity to say, okay, listen, but science will help you better make decisions on how to solve your problems because the basis of chemistry and physics, right, it's for all kids. We're talking about all kids, right? Reading Brett or Scott's comment. Perfect. I mean, this is it, right? I mean, science for a very long time has been taught as the history class of the natural world. And that no longer needs to be the case, right? Like the fact of the matter is all of our kids are going to be walking around with one of these in their pockets, right? Whether they are now or whether they will in the future. And these things only get smarter and smarter. So having just content knowledge alone isn't necessarily all that important because all they need to do is say, hey Siri or whatever, and it's going to do answer their questions for them. So we need to make sure that we give them that stronger, deeper conceptual understanding that'll help them make sense of things. um, and again, looking at that triangle, the depth only comes with them being able to actually engage and do it themselves. Here's a little more of the why, and then we're done with this. So read these last two paragraphs, kind of put in your final thoughts in regards to what is this big vision that we're talking about, right? What is the vision that we want our kids to be able to learn in regards to science and science education? Thank you, Robert. Yeah, I completely agree. So when you look at these things, this is the hope, right? No longer is the hope just being that we have kids who can memorize all the different steps of mitosis, right? Which, by the way, was one of my biggest goals as a biology teacher. Like, I really wanted my kids to understand it. I don't, not really sure why, but I did. And you have to ask yourself, like I had to, why? Like, what does a kid get from this, right? Like, how does this really help? Like, I still think about my daughter. I bring this up way too much, and some of you have heard me speak, have probably heard the story too, who came home with this piece of paper with Oreo cookies glued all over it. And she said, Dad, I know all the phases of the moon. Test me, Dad. Test me. And I said, awesome. Well, that's great. Let's look at this. And I would point to one and she'd be like, Dad, that's easy. That is a, what was the one? Oh, full moon. That's easy, Dad, full moon. And I point to another one. She's like, waxing gibbous. I mean, she was so proud in the knowledge that she had. And then I said, all right, Em, let me move this up a bit. And I said, we were in our kitchen. So I got a glass. I said, okay, this represents the sun, and this represents the earth, and this represents the moon. Can you show me what these three look like to make a full moon? And she looked at me and had no idea what I was talking about. And I said, okay, well, why does it change? Why does the shape of the moon face change over time? Like, what is causing that? No idea. This was the best part because my wife was also in the kitchen and she said, Emma, it's because of the shadow of the earth on the moon. And I was like, just don't listen to your mother. Because again, it shows that even back then, for the longest time, we're just teaching facts. And I asked the question, like, when do you ever need to know what phase the moon is in, right? As opposed to understanding the relationship between the earth, the sun, and the moon and why things are happening. The depth of knowledge is what we're really pushing for here. So we want kids to have understanding of to why these things are happening in the world around them, in the natural world, right? So to move on, what does this mean, right? So try to summarize these things. This is what are students doing, right? They're gathering information about phenomena that they can use to investigate and explain. They're reasoning what that data means to help make sense of the world. They're the ones being like, the evidence says this and therefore, right? Communicating their understanding, identifying problems, designing solutions to problems, evaluating solutions to problems, right? Like, this is what students are doing, right? Then the other side is, what are the teachers doing? So our role as a teacher has kind of changed. While instead of being the one giving all the answers, our job really now is to present students with the phenomena, find something that's going to engage them and give them the chance to really look into them, to have questions, to be curious, to make sense of them, investigate, explain, and then be a support along the way to support them with some scaffolding to get there. Now, again, like all scaffolding in education, we build strong supports at the beginning of the year. And as time goes by, we hopefully start taking those back to giving the kids from all ages, K-12, some more opportunity to start building their understanding, right? Providing students with data, videos, articles, whatever they need to help gather information. And then again, presenting students issues for them to be able to kind of make sense of and problem solve, right? There's a comment. I want to make sure I'm not caught up. Right. Yeah, no, I agree, right? So, I mean, it is the basic knowledge. They do have to have a basic understanding. But what I'm trying to say is that by teaching the bigger concepts, right, this bigger idea of Earth, Sun, and Moon, they're going to get those extra things. So make sure we're focusing on the roots of why we're doing this and not just getting straight to the answer, if that makes sense at all. The biggest thing I want to say is sometimes when teachers read this, they go, oh, I don't know, my kids, they can't do this, like this is too much. But they do, they can do this and they will do this. All it takes is a bit of time and effort. And I like how Mike described it also this morning, right, where it's like it just takes some routines. And again, kids can do this. Kids are doing this now all over the nation, and that's one thing that's so wonderful. And sometimes the teachers were like, "Oh, this is too hard." Same thing, you got this. So let's talk about what are some supports that are out there that can help you. So I'm going to talk about, well, 4 things on bullet lists, but there's actually more than just these 4 here. So the first and foremost is our OER science textbooks. If you've never heard of these before, we're going to spend some time talking about these textbooks. Now, again, textbooks obviously are not the only answer to this teaching that we're talking about, but they are a strong support that align to our standards. The next thing are core guides. We'll talk about those and what a core guide is. We'll look about some online courses on Canvas that are available to help support you as teachers to kind of better understand these shifts and what these standards really mean and the vision of the standards, and then introduce you with links to tons of different district resources that are available for lessons and ideas. So the OER textbooks, right? So first off, as a basic background, if you've never heard of this before, the teachers and content specialists come together and they look at our standards and they say, okay, what kind of content would I put into a textbook? These books are written by Utah teachers. They align now, again, they've been redone, so they align to the SEED standards. Each standard has a chapter that starts with a phenomenon, so at least can get you started, get you some ideas on how you can explore it. Here are some examples of these books, right? The very first chapter, so the first one's a first grade book, then a fifth grade book, and this last one is an earth science book, right? So again, we start them with some kind of a phenomenon where they can look at this, be like, huh, what are my questions? And what's going on here? And why is this going on? And those kind of things, kind of get them thinking about this a little more. Again, I want to spend some time with this, is that these books are all available on our USBE website. I don't have a link for here for some reason. I guess I forgot that, but if you just Google USBE, Utah State Board of Education, USBE Science, and there's a tab that specifically says OER textbook. You can go there and you can find these books and look at them. They're free to download as PDFs, and if you'd like to order them as a physical copy, we have we're using the state contract, so you can order them that way. So again, we don't make money off of this. We just, it's nothing like that. It's just a way for you to get access to these resources for fairly cheap. If you wanted to buy books, they're like $2 to $5 a piece. The next thing are core guides. I talked before about how the standards are these chunks that seem almost overwhelming. Core guides are documents that are created for each of the standards that are going to give more depth for teachers to really understand, what is this, right? What is the 3 dimensions? What is my practice? What is my cross-cutting concept? What is my core idea that I'm really trying to hit on here with these standards? They're going to look specifically at progressions. They're going to look at some examples of phenomena, or maybe even some vocabulary of sorts that you want to make sure that your kids have some understanding of. They're going to be looking at some sentence stems or some possible assessment ideas. There's going to give you that depth that you need to better understand what each of these standards are. So again, this is something that's still being created. We actually are fairly close to being done and releasing them here for a public review in the next few weeks. So look for an email through the Utah State Board of Education Science email listserv, and we can get you that, and you'll be able to see those as they come out. The next thing are the Canvas courses. There are 2 types of courses. I'm going to kind of go through this really quickly because this mostly as secondary teachers, this won't really affect you. But for our elementary teachers, because there's a lot of new content in the shifting of things, they teach an integrated content, right? And so because of that, they might have gotten new things that they've never taught before. And so we've created some online content courses to help support them in their content knowledge. They're made, these courses are made specifically for oh wait, I think I'm ahead of myself. Oh, I am, darn it. Okay, so let me go to this one first. These courses are specifically made for elementary teachers. So again, if you want as a secondary teacher to do it, that's great. You won't get any credit for doing it because most of you hopefully will know the content in these so well that you can just go and take the test and it's not really worth your time. But if you wanted to review it, we welcome you to do that. Just know that USB credit's only gonna be given to the elementary teachers. So, but this one actually is different. I was looking down like, wait, this isn't what I was talking about. This is an online course that we created that all teachers can participate in K-12. They're going to take some time going through each of the dimensions of the science. We're going to look specifically at how those work within the standards. We're going to look at the vision and what these things could look like in your classroom practice. We'll look specifically at what these phenomena are, how to identify strong phenomena, how do we use them with students. And then there's also a section specific to engineering. I know as science teachers, when I first started talking about this, people started getting a little overwhelmed with this idea of, wait, I teach engineering and this is in my standards too. And yes, it is, but we'll talk about how that works and why they work so well with science. So again, we invite you to go ahead and look at these. Again, same thing, they're on our USBE website. I thought I added a bit.ly there, I guess I didn't. But it's if you go to just Google USBE Science, there's a tab that says Professional Learning. You can go there, you can find these courses fairly easily. So the last thing that I want to talk about, and then we'll open up for some questions if you have them, is simply looking at some of, we have different districts that have been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. As some of you know, our larger districts have a lot more teachers and therefore a lot more resources. I mean, I still remember the first time I went out to Grand County and I met the only 7th grade science teacher in the district, right? And I was just kind of like, who do you work with? I couldn't understand that as a teacher who taught my entire career in Salt Lake County and had access to 2 other 7th grade teachers in my building, let alone others in the school down the street. Like, so again, these are resources that these masses of teachers are being able to put together that are available for you to see and explore and see if they work for you. We invite you to try them out and see if they work. So these first 4 are districts that have been doing that. The San Juan one is has a lot of stuff specific to teacher professional learning more so than just lessons themselves, but the first 3 have a lot of lessons. If you haven't heard of Seed Storylines yet, that's one that's become really popular. As a quick update, the Seed Storylines now, they have Seed Storylines, which are their Davis School District's version of the curriculum their teachers will be using. It's been created by them. They only have it now from K to 8. Their plan was to get their science teachers together here in the spring and have them ready in time for the summer, but then COVID hit and they couldn't get teachers together. The process kind of stopped. So they're hoping to get started back in the summer online, and if not, it might not even get done until fall. But be looking at this website because as they are creating things throughout the year, they will be adding them. The last one I want to bring to your attention down here, the last 2, is at the bottom. There's one called Going 3D with GRC. This is a website from Brett Molding. He is a past science specialist here in our state who now does professional learning all over the country. And he's worked with teachers and created some really wonderful lessons that align to the next generation science standards, but also therefore align to our standards because of the connections there. And also the last one to look at is our IC groups, the Informal Science Education Enhancements. If you go to that website, each of these museums, some of them have created specific lessons that align to our standards as well. So this next year, 2021, is the first year of implementation. So here's something that you can do this summer to kind of start preparing yourself. First, become familiar with the standards. Don't just look at what content is there, but try to be thinking of in what lens do they want you to be looking at this, with what cross-cutting concept and what practice. Become familiar with the K-12 framework, probably by taking our online course that we discussed. Think of some engaging labs and activities, lessons that you use now, and how can you shift them to kind of make them more phenomenon-based and get kids more active without giving away all the answers right at the very beginning and letting them try to make sense of that. Look at the resources available through the state and others. And again, most importantly, let us know here at the state what we can do to kind of help you out. And again, I guess we finished with this with only a minute left for questions, but you got this, right? Understand that this will be the first year of doing this for most of our high school teachers. Some started it last year. But in doing that, I ask you to be strong and flexible and try it out. See what it is that your kids love doing and keep using those things. You don't have to change what you're doing. Keep working on what it is that you're doing and try to make it even better, right? So if there are questions, you can go ahead and use the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. Here's my email address if you'd like to reach me or have any questions specific to what I have. If you'd like also, on the SCED, I put a link to a folder that has this document in it. So if you want to be able to click on any of those hyperlinks that I know you can't click on, you can go there. And also, yeah, follow me on Twitter. It's at RRScott. I don't know why Scott, but anyway, but RRScott. And yeah, and let me know what I could do to help. If you have questions, stick around and we can chat. If not, enjoy the rest of your day and have a wonderful conference. Thanks so much.